For thousands of years, people in the Sherpa villages of Nepal's Solukhumbu district built their homes from stone, with walls stretching nearly a meter thick and windows so small you could barely fit your head through them. Visitors from lower elevations called these houses cramped and primitive. That was 2020. By 2021, families in Houston, Texas, one of the wealthiest cities in the richest country on earth, were burning furniture inside their living rooms just to stay alive through a week of freezing temperatures. Those thick-walled Sherpa houses at 4,000 meters above sea level never needed a power grid. They never needed a furnace. And they kept people warm through Himalayan winters for 500 years straight. The question worth asking is not how mountain people survived the cold. The question is why we decided their answers were no longer worth remembering. The same knowledge that kept a Sherpa family warm at 14,000 feet would have saved lives in Texas. That detail is not a metaphor. It is an engineering fact. And the story of how we forgot it runs through 3 mountain ranges, 5 continents, and one of the worst infrastructure failures in American history. The compact stone homes of Khumbu were built with every wall facing south. That was not an aesthetic choice. The Sherpa understood something about solar orientation that modern passive house engineers rediscovered only in the last few decades. By positioning the main living space to catch the maximum arc of winter sunlight, and by keeping the window openings small and sparse, the houses trapped warmth inside walls that functioned like thermal batteries. Stone absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly through the night. A single masonry stove in the center of the home did the rest. The layout of these villages was not random either. Sherpa settlements clustered tightly together, creating windbreaks from neighboring structures. The density was deliberate. Each house shielded the next from the mountain gusts that strip heat from an exposed surface faster than any open window. And those tiny windows that outsiders found so odd served a dual purpose. They reduced heat loss in the winter and prevented the intense high-altitude sun from overheating the interior in summer. Temperature regulation built into rock and geometry, no wiring required. And here is something that rarely comes up in conversations about traditional architecture. The Sherpa people migrated to Nepal from Kham, a region of eastern Tibet, roughly 500 years ago. They crossed some of the highest mountain passes on Earth carrying almost nothing. When they arrived in the Solukhumbu region, they had to figure out how to survive at altitude with only the materials the land provided. Stone, timber, mud. That was it. No imported materials. No supply chains. No hardware stores. Everything they built came from within walking distance. What they developed over those 5 centuries was not just shelter. It was a thermal system, tested across generations and refined through the kind of trial and error that only comes from watching what kills people and what keeps them alive. The Sherpa did not write engineering textbooks. They did not need to. The walls remembered. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because this approach was not unique to the Himalayas. Thousands of miles away, in the Swiss Alps, communities arrived at almost identical conclusions through completely independent experimentation. Traditional chalets built from larch or spruce timber used wide, overhanging eaves to keep snow away from the walls and foundations. The steep-pitched roofs, covered in wooden shingles or slate, let snow accumulate just enough to act as a natural insulating blanket without piling heavy enough to collapse the structure. Inside, thick log walls and compact rooms retained heat from a central masonry stove, often the only source of warmth in the entire building. Swiss builders elevated their chalets on stone foundations to prevent moisture damage and improve insulation from the frozen ground. They oriented the main living quarters to face south. They kept window counts low on the upper floors. If you showed the floor plan of a traditional Swiss chalet to a Sherpa builder from Nepal without any context, the Sherpa would recognize the logic immediately. 2 cultures separated by 6,000 miles and several thousand years of independent development, solving the same problem with the same answers. That is not a typo, by the way. 2 completely unrelated civilizations working in 2 completely different mountain ranges built nearly the same house for nearly the same reasons. And neither of them had access to a thermodynamics textbook. So yeah, Not great for the modern assumption that traditional building is unsophisticated. The alpine chalet builders even stacked firewood on their balconies during winter, and that was not just storage. The stacked logs created an additional insulation layer against wind, rain, and snow on the exposed face of the building. Farmers dried hay on those same balconies and dropped it through trap doors to feed livestock in the stables below. The cold winter air turned the balcony into a natural refrigerator, so families used it as a pantry. Every square meter of the structure served at least two purposes. Nothing was wasted. In the Italian-speaking canton of Ticino, the approach shifted again. Where German-speaking Swiss used timber, the people of Ticino built from stone, with granite roofs and thick walls that kept interiors cool in summer and warm in winter. Different material, same principle. The mountain taught the lesson, and the culture adapted it to whatever the local ground provided. Regional diversity in material, total consistency in thermal logic. Someone saw this coming and said something about it. Architects working on sustainable design in the Alps have spent the last 30 years studying these traditional techniques, and the conclusion keeps landing in the same place. The old builders already knew most of what modern green architecture is trying to relearn. Passive solar orientation, thermal mass, natural insulation, windbreak planning. The vocabulary is new, but the principles are ancient. The mountains taught more than architecture, though. They taught people how to eat through the cold months when nothing grows, and the solution that emerged in the Andes might be the most underrated food innovation in human history. High in the Altiplano of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, above 3,500 meters, the Quechua and Aymara peoples developed a technique for preserving potatoes that predates the Inca Empire. They called the finished product chuño. The process works like this. After the potato harvest, farmers spread the tubers across flat ground at high elevation, where the night temperatures drop well below freezing. The potatoes freeze solid overnight. During the day, the intense high-altitude sunlight thaws and begins to dehydrate them. Farmers trample the potatoes underfoot, pressing out the remaining moisture. Then the cycle repeats. Freeze overnight, thaw during the day, trample, repeat. 5 days of this, and the potato is transformed into a lightweight, rock-hard, completely shelf-stable product that can last for years. And here is the detail that everyone missed at the time, or rather, that nobody outside the Andes paid attention to for centuries. The Quechua and Aymara had essentially invented freeze-drying, the same preservation technology that NASA famously used to prepare food for astronauts was not developed in a laboratory in 1906, as most history books claim. It was developed by indigenous mountain farmers in South America at least 700 years earlier. Archaeological evidence near Lake Titicaca puts the earliest confirmed use of chuño production at around 600 BCE. That means people were freeze-drying food 2,600 years before anyone in the industrialized world thought of it. That is the kind of number that makes food scientists uncomfortable. Incan armies marched across an empire that stretched 4,000 kilometers along the spine of the Andes, and chuño was the fuel that made those campaigns possible. Light enough for soldiers to carry in bulk, calorie-dense enough to sustain them through weeks of marching, and stable enough that massive quantities could be stored in state-controlled warehouses across the empire. Without chuño, the logistical challenge of feeding an army at altitude in freezing conditions would have been nearly impossible to solve. The Inca knew that. They built their supply chain around it. The Inca understood something else, too. Bitter potato varieties that are toxic when eaten raw become perfectly safe after the chuño process. The freeze-thaw cycle and the trampling break down glycoalkaloids, the natural toxins in certain potato species. So the Andean peoples did not just preserve their food, they detoxified it at the same time, using nothing but altitude, cold air, sunlight, and the soles of their feet. That is, chemistry performed without chemistry. And it worked consistently for centuries before anyone in Europe even knew potatoes existed. And today, the process is still practiced in Andean communities. Families in rural Peru and Bolivia still make chuño the same way their ancestors did, trampling potatoes with their bare feet on frozen ground in the early morning hours. The recipe has not changed because it did not need to change. The mountains provided the freezer. The sun provided the dehydrator. The human foot provided the press. 3 free inputs, 0 technology required, and the result outperformed anything the industrial world produced for the next 2 millennia. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about why the old knowledge matters now more than ever. Climate change is warming the nights near Lake Titicaca. The freezing temperatures that the chuño process depends on are becoming less reliable. Fields that have produced chuño for generations are now, in some years, not cold enough to freeze the tubers properly. The very cold that these communities learned to harness is disappearing, and with it, the food system they built around it. The cold was never the enemy. The cold was the tool. That understanding runs through every mountain culture on the planet, and nowhere is it more visible than on the Tibetan Plateau, where the relationship between people and cold is mediated almost entirely through one animal, the yak. On the highest inhabited plateau on Earth, Tibetan nomads built a complete civilization around a single species of shaggy, cold-adapted bovine. The yak provided milk for butter tea, the calorie-dense drink that fuels daily life at altitude. It provided meat for protein. Its thick, double-layered coat provided wool that nomadic herders twisted by hand and wove into blankets, cloaks, and the famous black tents of the grasslands. Those tents deserve their own mention. Woven from yak hair, they are hard in texture, warm in winter and cool in summer, easy to load and easy to transport. The rope twisted from yak hair is elastic, strong, and durable. And when pitched across the windswept plateau, these tents withstand conditions that would shred a modern camping tent in minutes. Nomads have been living in them for over 1,000 years. The design has barely changed because, like chuño, it did not need to. The yak's undercoat, known as kulu, has a hollow core fiber structure that traps heat with extraordinary efficiency while remaining breathable. Modern textile engineers have studied this fiber and found that it automatically adapts to temperature changes, keeping warmth in during freezing nights and releasing heat as conditions warm during the day. It does not hold odors the way synthetic fabrics do. It is softer than sheep's wool and does not irritate sensitive skin. And it grows back every year during the natural molting season, harvested without harming the animal. Even yak dung found its purpose. On the Tibetan Plateau, where trees are scarce and temperatures can drop to -35 degrees, dried yak dung served as the primary fuel source for thousands of years. In the Tibetan language, the word for yak, dung, has no negative association. It translates roughly to fuel, and Tibetans consider it something practical and familiar rather than unpleasant. For millennia, nomadic families used it to make tea, cook meat, heat their tents, and light their homes. Nothing from the yak was discarded. Every part of the animal served the cold survival system. Yaks themselves are biological cold survival machines. Their large lungs contain more air pockets than lowland cattle, helping them absorb oxygen from the thin, high-altitude atmosphere. Their blood carries more red blood cells, which means more oxygen delivery to their muscles and organs. Their wide noses warm and moisten the cold, dry air before it reaches their lungs. And their thick, double-layered coat insulates them so effectively that they can stand in a blizzard at -40 degrees without distress. They have been adapted to the Tibetan Plateau for millions of years, and the Tibetan people figured out how to build an entire way of life around that adaptation. Sherpa communities in Nepal used yaks the same way. Yak herding, yak milk, yak butter tea, yak wool clothing. At high altitude, where every calorie counts and every degree of warmth can mean the difference between comfort and crisis, the yak was not a luxury. It was the center of everything. Most people never heard about this part, because the Western world was not paying attention. While Tibetan nomads were engineering a fully circular, zero-waste cold survival system using one domesticated species, the industrialized world was building something very different. It was building dependency. Dependency on electrical grids, on natural gas pipelines, on centralized heating systems controlled by utility companies hundreds of miles away from the homes they served. And as long as those systems worked, nobody questioned whether that dependency was a risk. The convenience was real. Central heating is more comfortable than a yak dung stove. Nobody is arguing otherwise. The question is, what happens when the system that provides that convenience breaks? And the answer, as it turns out, is that people who have never had to think about cold suddenly have to survive it with none of the knowledge their ancestors took for granted. That knowledge gap is not a metaphor. It is measurable. In communities where traditional cold survival practices have been maintained, winter mortality during extreme events is dramatically lower than in communities that depend entirely on grid infrastructure. The mountain peoples did not just build houses and make food. They built a relationship with cold that made them resilient to it. We traded that relationship for a thermostat. February 2021 answered the question. When Winter Storm Uri hit Texas, temperatures across the state dropped to levels not seen in 70 years. In Austin, the thermometer fell from 0 degrees Celsius on February 11th to -14 on the 15th. Natural gas pipelines froze. 8,000 megawatts of gas-fired power plants shut down because of fuel shortages or freezing equipment. Another 2,000 megawatts of wind power went offline when ice formed on turbine blades and substations. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, known as ERCOT, ordered rolling blackouts at 1:25 in the morning on February 15th to prevent the complete collapse of the grid. It was the largest manually controlled load-shedding event in United States history. 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power, some for hours, many for days. The consequences were catastrophic. Water pipes froze and burst, flooding homes that were already without heat. Families huddled around outdoor grills to stay warm. People melted snow on their stovetops just to have drinking water. Grocery stores ran out of food as supply chains collapsed. Hospitals kept their generators running but lost water pressure. And at least 246 people died, many of them from hypothermia. Some estimates place the true death toll closer to 700 when indirect deaths are included, and this did not happen in the Arctic. It did not happen in the mountains. It happened in one of the largest, wealthiest, most energy-rich states in the most technologically advanced country on the planet. The infrastructure that was supposed to make cold irrelevant had never been winterized. Federal authorities had warned about this vulnerability years before the storm. Those warnings were largely ignored because Texas had built its energy system around cost savings and market competition, not resilience. The deregulated system lacked financial incentives for maintenance and weatherproofing, and effective oversight was absent. A warning sign if there ever was one. Texas ignored it. What an engineer from the University of Texas later observed about the crisis is worth sitting with. He said that if an energy-abundant, wealthy state that enjoys investing in infrastructure can suffer this kind of catastrophic energy failure, then it can happen anywhere. The root of the disaster sits in a decision made decades earlier. In the 1990s, Texas dismantled its centralized utility model in favor of a competitive, market-based system of private generators, transmission operators, and energy retailers. The goal was to lower consumer costs and encourage innovation. What it actually did was eliminate the financial incentives for weatherproofing infrastructure. Nobody wanted to pay for resilience because resilience does not show up on a quarterly earnings report. The system optimized for profit in normal conditions and became catastrophically fragile in abnormal ones. A similar cold snap hit Texas around Christmas of 2022. And while rolling blackouts were avoided, power plants and natural gas facilities still failed in the below-freezing temperatures. The fixes had closed some gaps, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. A system built on the assumption that extreme cold is rare will always be surprised by extreme cold. And that brings us back to the mountains. Because here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. A Sherpa village at 14,000 feet, with no electricity, no gas lines, and no grid connection of any kind, would have survived Winter Storm Uri without a single casualty. The stone walls would have held their heat. The compact room design would have retained body warmth. The central stove, burning whatever solid fuel was available, would have kept the interior livable. The community's food stores, preserved through traditional methods, would not have depended on refrigeration that requires electricity. And the people themselves, having lived with the cold as a daily reality rather than an abstraction managed by a thermostat, would have known how to dress, how to conserve heat, and how to wait out a storm. The same is true for the Inuit communities of the Canadian Arctic, who for centuries built igloos from compacted snow that maintained interior temperatures of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius while the outside air sat at -50. The engineering behind the igloo is not primitive. It is precise. An experienced Inuit builder can construct one in under 2 hours using nothing but a saw and the right kind of wind-packed snow. The dome shape distributes structural load evenly. The spiral construction of interlocking blocks eliminates weak points. The entrance tunnel sits below the main floor, creating a cold sink that traps frigid air at the lowest level while warm air rises to the sleeping platform above. Body heat and a single oil lamp do the rest. Some Inuit communities built interconnected igloo complexes, linking multiple smaller domes through their entrance tunnels to create villages under the snow. The largest structures served as communal gathering spaces for feasts, ceremonies, and traditional dances. They were not just shelters. They were social infrastructure, built from frozen water and shaped by thousands of years of collective memory about what works and what does not. The central Inuit who lived around the Davis Strait took the system further. They lined the interior walls of their igloos with animal skins, which bumped the inside temperature from around 2 degrees Celsius up to between 10 and 20 degrees. A simple material addition, and the comfort level changed dramatically. Compacted snow contains countless tiny air pockets that trap air, and since air is a poor conductor of heat, those pockets create exceptional insulation. This is the exact same principle used in modern foam insulation. The Inuit figured it out without knowing the vocabulary for it. They did not need the vocabulary. They had the results. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. Because nearly 70% of national climate adaptation plans worldwide now explicitly recognize indigenous knowledge as important for dealing with changing conditions. Countries like Argentina, Guatemala, Nepal, and Timor-Leste have proposed concrete mechanisms to support indigenous participation in climate planning. The academic world has caught on. The policy world has caught on. The building world has mostly not. Modern construction still overwhelmingly depends on active heating systems, centralized energy grids, and materials that perform poorly when the power goes out. A concrete apartment building in a major city loses its internal temperature within hours of a grid failure. A glass-walled office tower is essentially a greenhouse in summer and a freezer in winter without constant mechanical climate control. The passive thermal principles that mountain peoples perfected over centuries, thick walls, thermal mass, strategic orientation, compact design, natural insulation, have been traded for aesthetics and cost efficiency in most modern construction. The clock was already ticking, we just could not hear it yet. Climate scientists warn that extreme cold events, paradoxically, may become more frequent in some regions as the jet stream destabilizes. The polar vortex events that sent Arctic air sweeping into Texas and across Europe are not going away. They may intensify. Europe experienced its own brutal cold snaps that strained energy grids and left vulnerable populations without adequate heating. Each event follows the same pattern. The cold arrives, the grid strains. The people who depend entirely on centralized systems are the ones who suffer most. And every time they hit, the same question surfaces. Why are our systems so fragile? Why does a week of cold weather collapse infrastructure that cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build? The mountains had the answer all along. The cold is not something to defeat, it is something to work with. The Sherpa understood that when they positioned their houses to catch winter sunlight. The Quechua understood it when they laid their potatoes out to freeze under the Andean stars. The Tibetan nomads understood it when they wove yak wool into tents that flexed with the wind instead of fighting it. The Inuit understood it when they built their shelters from the very substance that was trying to kill them. Every one of those solutions shared a common principle. They did not try to eliminate the cold. They accepted it, studied it, and turned it into an advantage. The cold preserved food. The cold provided building material. The cold shaped the fibers that kept people warm. The cold was infrastructure. The irony cuts deep. Modern insulation science, the stuff used in the walls of brand new energy-efficient homes, works on the exact same principle as the igloo. Trapped air pockets, reducing heat transfer. We gave it a technical name. We patented the materials. We marketed them as innovations. And the Inuit had been using the concept for centuries, building emergency shelters in under 2 hours from free materials that fell out of the sky. The Sherpa never called their south-facing walls passive solar design. The Quechua never submitted a patent for freeze-drying. The Tibetans never published a paper on the thermal properties of yak wool fiber. They just used what worked. And what worked because they paid attention to the cold instead of trying to pretend it was not there. Modern civilization looked at the cold and saw a problem to overpower with energy. Mountain civilizations looked at the cold and saw a partner to negotiate with through design. One of those approaches collapses when the power goes out. The other has been running for thousands of years. The thick stone walls of Khumbu are still standing. The people who built them are still warm. And if you think this story ended with Texas, the video on screen covers the other piece of ancient knowledge that modern science is just now catching up to.